This is Alice in Wonderland, Chapter 8, by Lewis Carroll, The Queen's Croquet Ground. And I've got my notebook here. I've already dated it, and I wrote Alice in Wonderland, and then I wrote Chapter 8, The Queen's Croquet Ground. The large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, while there were 3 gardeners at it busily painting them red. That's kind of funny, painting the roses red. Alice thought this was a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them. And just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say, "Look out now, 5! Don't go splashing paint over me like that." "I couldn't help it," said 5, in a sulky tone. 7 jogged my elbow, on which 7 looked up and said, "That's right, 5. Always lay the blame on others." "You'd better not talk," said 5. "I heard the Queen say only yesterday that you deserve to be beheaded." "What for?" said the one who had spoken first. "That's none of your business, 2, said 7. "Yes, it is his business," said 5, "and I'll tell him. It was for bringing the cook tulip roots instead of onions." 7 flung down his brush, and had just begun, "Well, of all the unjust things," when his eyes chanced to fall upon Alice, as she stood there watching them, and he checked himself suddenly. The others looked round also, and all of them bowed low. "Would you tell me," said Alice, a little timidly, "why you are painting those roses?" 5 and 7 said nothing, but looked at 2. 2 began in a low voice, "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, when we put a white one in by mistake. And if the Queen was to find out, we should all have our heads cut off, you know. So you see, miss, we're doing our best afore she comes to..." And I think this would be a place where I would probably draw a rose bush. Okay, here's my rose bush. And then I'd probably draw some roses in the bush. Okay. Because this is kind of how this one starts out. Alright, and if I took my time, I probably could draw better roses, but I'm not taking my time. I'm just sort of drawing what is coming to me. So, and then I usually keep some colors right close. So these roses are red. So he's saying they put in a red rose bush by accident. But the Queen doesn't like red. She's going to behead them if it's red. So they're painting it white. So I will probably put a paintbrush, maybe like this. Here's a paintbrush. Okay, and probably do that. Now I really don't know what these gardeners look like, so I'm not even going to attempt to draw them. But this is white, and I might get out even a white colored pencil to do that. So, and I'm going to say actually painting the roses white. Okay, because that is what will please this Queen. Alright. So at this moment, 5, who had been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was a sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked round, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next, the 10 couriers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds, and walked 2 and 2, as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along hand in hand, in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognized the white rabbit. It was talking in a hurriedly nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then, following the knave of hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion, and last of all this grand procession came the king and queen of hearts. Alice Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought to lie down on her face like the three gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions, and besides, what would be the use of a procession, she thought, if people all had to lie down upon their faces so that they couldn't see it? So she stood still where she was, and she waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her, and the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" She said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot!" said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently, and turning to Alice, she went on, "What is your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely. "But," she added to herself, "why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I needn't be afraid of them. So this procession, this group of people, this group of stuff that's come out, it's like a deck of cards, but they're all walking. So that might be something else that I would draw. I probably couldn't draw everybody, but I might go back into the text and look and see, there's 10 children, there's the king and the queen, and I might kind of just draw them like this. And then I might draw the cards, so we have the hearts, right? And we have, in a deck of cards, think about it, what other things you see in a deck of cards. There's diamonds, right? And in a deck of cards, we have, what looks like a shamrock, right? Clubs. There we go. And spades is the last thing that we have. So sort of this piece of the story here is based off of a deck of cards. So, and Alice she's not sure she should be intimidated or, how she should react, and then she realizes they're cards, and she has a moment of clarity where she said, I don't have to be scared of cards, and that's a good reality check for Alice, and for all of us, right? And who are these? Said the Queen, pointing to the 3 gardeners who were lying around the rose tree, for you see, as they were lying on their faces, and the pattern on their backs was the same as the rest of the pack, she could not tell whether they were gardeners, soldiers, courtiers, or 3 of her own children, because they were all cards, right? And they were all laying on the ground like everybody else. How should I know? Said Alice, surprised at her own courage. It's no business of mine. The Queen turned crimson with fury, and after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, screamed, "Off with her head! Off!" So I'm actually going to write that, because that saying comes up a lot in this story, or a reference to that saying, "Off with her head." And this is a good one to use in your own writing if you're writing a fiction story. But I love how this happens, because this queen card, is so powerful, so, and she wants to order off with her head to Alice. Alice actually has a head, cards don't. Okay. So off. Nonsense, said Alice, very loudly and decidedly. So Alice is getting some courage. And the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand upon her arm and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she is only a child." The Queen turned angrily away from him and said to the Knave, "Turn them over." The Knave did so, very carefully, with 1 foot. "Get up," said the Queen in a shrill, loud voice, and the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the King and Queen, the royal children, and everybody else. "Leave off that!" screamed the Queen. "You make me giddy." And here, turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" "May it please your Majesty," said 2, in a very humble tone, going down on one knee as he spoke. "We were trying—" "I see," said the Queen, who had meanwhile been examining the roses. "Off with their heads!" "There we go again," said the procession, and the procession moved on, 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners, who ran to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, as she put them in a large flower pot that stood near. The 3 soldiers wandered about for a minute or two, looking for them, and then quietly marched off after the others. Are their heads off? Shouted the Queen. Heads are gone, if it please your majesty, the soldiers shouted in reply. That's right, shouted the Queen. Can you play croquet? This is sort of a drastic difference in topic. But anyway, okay, can you play croquet? The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. Yes, shouted Alice. So now the Queen has just invited Alice to play croquet, which, if you don't know much about croquet, it's, because you might not know this word, croquet, it's a game where you have like this hammer-looking thing made of wood, and it's like a mallet, I guess, would be a good way to describe it. That kind of looks more like an axe. It's not an axe, it's like a hammer, but it's made out of wood, so it's very solid. And then you have some croquet balls, right? And then you have to use the wooden hammer to hit the ball, and they have to make it go through like gates. Through so many gates. So that's basically how you play croquet, and usually play with a group of people. You could play it by yourself, and it's played in different places around the world even. So that's the game of croquet, though. So it's a game. Okay. So, come on then, roared the Queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. It's a very fine day, said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the White Rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. Very, said Alice. Where's the Duchess? Hush, hush, said the Rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder, and he spoke, and then raised himself up on his tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, She's under the sentence of execution. What for? Said Alice. Did you say, what a pity? The Rabbit asked. No, I didn't, said Alice. I don't think it's at all a pity. I said, what for? She boxed the Queen's ears, the Rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. Oh, hush, said the Rabbit. Hush, the Rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. The Queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late. The Queen... Get to your places! Shouted the Queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or two, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such curious croquet ground in her life. It was all ridges and furrows, and the balls were live hedgehogs, the mallets live flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up to stand on their hands and feet to make arches. Okay, so that's very silly. So I just gave you an idea of what croquet looks like, actually. But look what actually happened in this story. So normally croquet would be a somewhat even ground. It would not be all ridges. And the balls were live hedgehogs, so instead of a ball, right, they're playing with these live hedgehogs, I guess. Okay, so these cute little hedgehogs are the croquet balls, and then the mallets are live flamingos. So if we just, I cannot draw a flamingo at all, but here's the flamingo's legs, and here's the flamingo's beaks and their bodies. There we go. Okay, so it's the flamingos, and then the soldiers had to double themselves up to stand on their hands and feet to make arches. So here's the soldiers. Instead of this wire, this small wire, it's a person actually bent onto their hands and feet. So here we go. Just bend over like this. Oh, I gave him bird feet. I don't know why. And then the hedgehog's going to actually go through kind of like where the soldier is standing. It's like sort of like that. Anyway, so that's a very different sort of game. This is not how it's usually played. This is how it's usually played. Okay, well, that's what's happening. The mallets. Okay. The chief difficulty Alice found at first was in managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm, with its legs hanging down, but generally she just had got its neck nicely straightened out, and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head. It would twist itself around and look up at her face, with such a puzzled expression that she could not help burst out laughing. And when she had got its head down and was going to begin again, it was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself, and it was in the act of crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge of furrow in the way whenever she wanted to send the hedgehog to, and as the doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once, without waiting for turns, quarreling all the while, and fighting for the hedgehogs, and in a very short time the queen was in a furious passion, and went stamping about and shouting, "Off with his head! Off with her head!" about once in a minute. It's a very famous saying from the Queen in Alice in Wonderland. Alice began to feel very uneasy. To be sure, she had not as yet had any dispute with the Queen, but she knew that it might happen any minute. And then she thought, what would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there's anyone left alive. She was looking for some way of escape and wondering whether she could get away without being seen, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin, and then she said to herself, "It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I have somebody to talk to." "How are you getting on?" said the cat, as soon as there was mouth enough for it to speak with. Alice waited till the eyes appeared, and then nodded. "It's no use speaking to it," she thought, "till its ears have come, or at least one of them." In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo and began an account of the whole game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think that there was enough of it now in sight, and no more of it appeared. "I don't think they play at all fairly," Alice began in a rather complaining tone. "And they all quarrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak, and they don't seem to have any rules in particular, at least if there are, nobody attends to them. So you have no idea how confusing it is, all the things being alive, for instance. There's an arch I've got to go through, next walking about at the other end of the ground, and I should have croqueted the Queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming. How do you like the Queen?" the cat said in a low voice. "Not at all," said Alice. "She's so extremely—" Just then she noticed that the Queen was close behind her, listening. So she went on, "Likely to win that it's hardly worth finishing the game." So she changed what she was going to say because the Queen was listening. It was going to be something kind of negative because she said she doesn't like the Queen. And then she changed it to something positive for the Queen. The Queen smiled and passed on. That was the desired effect. "Who are you talking to?" said the King, going up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire Cat," said Alice. "Allow me to introduce it." "I don't like the look of it at all," said the King. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes." "I'd rather not," the cat remarked. "Don't be impertinent," said the King, "and don't look at me like that." He got behind Alice as he spoke. "A cat may look at a king," said Alice. "I've read that in some book, but I don't remember where." "Well, it must be removed," said the King very decidedly, and he called the Queen, who was passing at the moment. "My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed." The Queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small. "Off with its head," she said, without even looking around. "I'll fetch the executioner myself," said the King eagerly, and he hurried off. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going on, as she heard the Queen's voice in the distance, screaming with passion. She had already heard her sentence 3 of the players to be executed for having missed their turns, so she did not like the look of things at all, as the game was in such confusion that she never knew whether it was her turn or not. So she went in search of her hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for croqueting one of them with the other. The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across to the other side of the garden, where Alice could see it, trying in a helpless sort of way to flip up into a tree. By the time she had caught the flamingo and brought it back, the fight was over, and both hedgehogs were out of sight. But it doesn't matter much, thought Alice, as all the arches are gone from this side of the ground. So she tucked it away under her arm, that it might not escape again, and then it went back for a little more conversation with her friend. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she was surprised to find quite a large crowd collected around it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the king, and the queen, who were all talking at once, while all the rest were silent, and looked very uncomfortable. The moment Alice appeared was appealed to by all three to settle the question, and they repeated their arguments to her, though as they all spoke at once, she found it very hard indeed to make out exactly what they said. The executioner's argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it from, and he had never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at his time of life. The king's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and that you weren't to talk nonsense. The queen's argument was that if something wasn't done about it in less than no time, she'd have everybody executed all round. It was this last remark that made the whole party look so grave and anxious. Alice could think of nothing else to say, but it belongs to the Duchess. You better ask her about it. She's in prison, the queen said to the executioner. Fetch her here. And the executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment he was gone, and by the time he'd come back with the Duchess, it had entirely disappeared. So the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it, while the rest of the party went back to the game. This is the end of chapter 8.